Welcome to today's Cybersecurity Insiders webinar, where we will talk about how to move beyond passwords and reduce security risks. Thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules. Today's webinar is brought to you by HYPR, the leading provider of true passwordless security. My name is Holger Schulze. I am the founder of Cybersecurity Insiders, the online community for cybersecurity professionals, and the publisher of the Cybersecurity Insiders Research Reports. And I'll be your moderator today. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our panel of cybersecurity and authentication experts. First, I'd like to welcome Abbie Barbir, and Abbie is Senior Security Advisor for CVS Health. Hello, Abbie.
Hello, glad to be here.
Excellent. Next, I'd like to welcome Andrew Shikair, and Andrew is Executive Director and CMO for the FIDO Alliance. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Holger.
Next, I'd like to welcome George Avetisov, and George is CEO of HYPR. Hello, George.
Hey, how's it going?
Going well. Thanks for presenting with us today. Yeah, I would also like to welcome Bojan Simic, and Bojan is CTO of HYPR. Hello, Bojan.
Hello, how are you?
Excellent. We have a great panel today. Gentlemen, thank you all for presenting today. And with that, George, can you tell us what's on the agenda for today's webcast?
Sure. So look, we're going to talk a little bit about how authentication has evolved and brought us to what we think is the passwordless decade. We're going to talk about the FIDO Authentication standard, all the incredible work that the FIDO Alliance is doing, and talk about how a company like CVS Health has been able to scale passwordless authentication with open standards such as FIDO. So it's going to be a really good talk. Thank you for having us, Holger. Yeah, we'll just dive right in. So look, a lot of people here are familiar with these stats, right? Credential reuse is getting worse. It hasn't gotten better. What's really alarming is that 1 out of every 2 login attempts on a consumer banking website is actually malicious, which is pretty alarming. And I think, you know, when you look at the sheer volume of credential stuffing attacks, it's never been worse. We have to ask ourselves, you know, how did we get here? You know, what exactly brought us to this point? And the way we do that is we should look at where we came from as a community in terms of authentication and digital identity. And maybe that could tell us a little bit about where we're going. So let's take a trip down memory lane. Passwords. Everybody loves them. The beautiful thing about passwords is that the way they were invented in the 60s is exactly the same way they're used today. Just like a gas-powered vehicle, it hasn't changed much over the years. And hopefully it's time for the electric car equivalent of a password. But, you know, passwords progressed into two-factor authentication. At one point, we got hardware tokens, became very popular. You all know these. You know, we love using them too. That's a lot of sarcasm for you. But they're often shared, they're often lost, and they're very expensive. So they never really made it to the mainstream. You know, like smart cards. Smart cards are another great example of hardware-based authentication, which, you know, they actually got really good adoption in key areas like the federal and public sectors, and you know, they have a good reputation, right? They make some IT admins very happy because they work, but they didn't get that widespread adoption that we saw with, you know, modalities like two-factor authentication via SMS. SMS 2FA is huge. We've seen it deployed across millions of users. Many people have used SMS 2FA every day for years now. Fortunately, it is also one of the worst authentication methods. You know, it's been deprecated by standards bodies. A lot of banks and industries are moving away from SMS two-factor. And, you know, a lot of companies have adopted the phone as a token method. You know, so this is a very familiar experience for people. You know, lots of us have many of these apps on our phones. Some folks actually use multiple apps each day. And the point here is to have a software-based OTP or, you know, push-based authentication. So they came pretty far. You know, people have adopted them at scale. But it's interesting to see that global MFA adoption has actually stalled in the last few years. People have, if you read the Internet Trends report from last year, buried somewhere on page 209, I think, is a stat that's a little bit alarming. And it looks like two-factor authentication has kind of hit a ceiling in terms of adoption. People often claim that it's just too slow, it's too difficult to use, and unfortunately, this is what hinders adoption, especially for customer and workforce use cases. So when we look at where we're at today, customer and workforce MFA adoption has hit a brick wall, more or less. Everybody's still using passwords. That has not changed in 6 years. And anybody can launch a pretty decent-sized credential reuse attack. Even a middle schooler can put together a pretty large-scale credential stuffing attack, and some of the headlines recently have proven this is a reality. So where are we going? Right? We know that things aren't great in the space of authentication, despite a lot of progress. But let's see if we can figure out where this space is going. A couple of years ago, a few companies really declared this passwordless era, right? HYPR coined the phrase true passwordless, where we really kind of announced that there's a new movement away from the password. It goes beyond just taking the password out of the experience, and it's about eliminating the use of passwords altogether. We saw a number of big companies, join in this movement, and today there's a lot of companies that believe that password-based MFA is really on its way out. The way we describe this problem is that, the passwords and shared secrets that have been used and stored inside the enterprise are really, on their way out. It's time to move forward. It's time to get rid of the hacker's favorite target, solve those MFA gaps that we've been seeing for years. And what we're moving towards as a community is what we call true passwordless authentication, or true passwordless MFA, in which case there are no passwords and shared secrets. The use of open standards such as FIDO, the use of personal devices such as your mobile phone, the use of biometrics such as Touch ID or Face ID have made it easy for us to move authentication back to the user side, right? Make it much more difficult for the attacker to have to attack each user. And essentially what this is it's really addressing that gap that we've had for many years. So look, if we could take a moment to think about how long this has taken to actually get to true passwordless. We really appreciate the difficulty of this problem that people are solving. And the key thing to remember is you're getting rid of passwords and shared secrets. That's essentially what the industry's doing. We're moving companies from a scenario where they are easy to attack to one where they are expensive to attack, where the password is taken out of the equation. How do you explain this to your boss or your board? We get this question quite a lot. It's kind of like a smart card on your smartphone. For folks who are familiar with FIDO, it's kind of like turning your smartphone into a FIDO token. This has been a widely used description, from some of our customers. And when it comes to adoption, you're going to see a lot of companies who have adopted and continue to scale this true passwordless authentication across a lot of use cases. Gartner tends to be a lagging indicator, and even they're saying that more than half of large companies are adopting and have adopted passwordless methods over the next 2 years. So this is really exciting, right? This is fantastic news. If you're in the space, it's very exciting to hear this and to know that it's happening. And that brings us to the question that this talk is about. Are we living in the passwordless decade? Is it finally going to be, a real passwordless movement and not just passwordless marketing? And the argument that we would present is that passwordless is finally ready for enterprise scale. So, you noticed a couple of trends where major browsers support the passwordless capability through open standards such as FIDO and WebAuthn. Operating systems now have passwordless capabilities built in. And even passwordless authenticators are built into much of the hardware that we use each day, whether it's things like Touch ID or Windows Hello. So, one thing that stands out to me is the FIDO standard. Andrew, if you're ready to go, I would love to show our audience a little bit about the awesome work that the FIDO Alliance is doing and how FIDO has actually made this possible. Because without the FIDO standard, I don't think that passwordless would even be able to exist or scale the way it is today.
Yeah, thanks, George, and it's really great to be here, and I appreciate you having me. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about FIDO Alliance, why we're formed, what we're doing, and a peek ahead and what's next for FIDO Alliance. So look, this isn't breaking news. There are problems with passwords. In fact, it's not breaking news because George just told you about these problems. We could probably spend the entire webinar going through slides and slides and slides of statistics about how risky passwords are. But I look at this a little bit differently. I look at these stats as really both the symptoms and the cause of FIDO's main mission, which is to solve the data breach problem. Right? So yes, we're trying to get rid of passwords and move beyond passwords. That's really because authentication is a tip of the spear in addressing the bigger plague of data breaches. And that's because the vast majority of data breaches are caused by credential issues or password issues. So that's what we're very much focused on. George talked about this a little bit, or a fair amount. We talked about shared secrets and what that problem means. So yes, FIDO is trying to come up with a simpler, stronger way of doing authentication that addresses the usability and security problems of passwords and OTPs. But the fundamental problem is a shared secret issue. When we talk about shared secrets, we're talking about passwords, yes, but also OTPs, really anything on a server. And the fundamental problem with server-side authentication methods that depend on shared secrets is that anything on a server can and eventually will be stolen and reused. So the statistic that George mentioned, over half of banking logins are stuffed logins or attempted spoof logins. I've seen data that 90% of e-commerce logins are fake logins. So think about the human capital costs, the IT costs, infrastructure costs associated with trying to prevent these logins, which actually have a success rate of around 3 to 4%, and you can start to get your arms around the problem. So what FIDO's trying to do is, yes, provide simpler, stronger authentication, but fundamentally moving the market from a system that's dependent on server-side shared secrets to one that allows users to authenticate in the devices in their hands every day through a simple, single gesture possession-based authentication that's very user-friendly that will help with MFA opt-in rates. Underneath this is, it uses asymmetric public key cryptography, which basically means that a unique key pair is created with each FIDO credential. There's a public key on the server. The private key is on the user's device. That's activated through this gesture. And through that, unique key pair, that's how, the marrying of that key pair is what allows someone to log in successfully and securely to online services. I talked about FIDO's mission. These are the companies that are currently helping drive this, right? So we have 42 companies on FIDO's board of directors. The way I looking at this slide is, if you ask yourself what companies need to sit around a table to address the password problem or the shared secret problem, it probably looks a lot like this, right? So we have all the major platform and device manufacturers that are, creating billions of devices at scale that need to have FIDO support built into them. We have specialists in identity and security, including HYPR, who bring either lots of historical expertise or new innovative approaches to protecting systems and services. And last but not least, we have companies like Aetna or CVS Health and other service providers whose businesses are entirely dependent upon their ability to deliver high assurance services to billions of users worldwide. So it's that combination of companies that really helps, establish the use cases and build the specifications and related assets that will help us move beyond shared secrets. Beyond the board, we have sponsor members. We have over 250 organizations involved in the alliance. Sponsor members drive a lot of the important work inside of our working groups. We have associate members who help build out the FIDO certified ecosystem. We have hundreds of FIDO certified products on market that all interoperate with each other. So that's the associate members largely. And then we have liaison partners. So we partner with like-minded organizations, either other technology.orgs or regional organizations that helps bring added use cases in education to adjacent technical markets or regional activities. So that's who FIDO is. We focused on day one on making FIDO real, right? So FIDO opened our doors in 2013. By 2014, we had our first set of specifications addressing both what I'll call primary authentication, so biometric authentication use cases, and also second factor authentication use cases. But the focus has always been on allowing FIDO to work across platform. Most recently, we've seen really great progress there with the release of FIDO 2. That's our latest set of specifications, which, as George referenced, has been built directly into operating systems. So directly into Windows 10, directly into Android, and perhaps most significantly, targeting the web as a platform itself. Right, so FIDO 2 includes something called Web Authentication or WebAuthn, which is a protocol supported by every major web browser and also with hooks tied into native operating systems. That's given true reach to FIDO across platforms, across devices. In fact, over 86% and growing of browsers today can support FIDO authentication. And this is why so many companies are deploying FIDO, right? So this is a subset of the companies that are actually deploying FIDO, but the idea here is to give you a feel for the breadth and depth and regional reach of who's using FIDO. You have large cloud service providers, you have banks from all over the world, we have governments, we see the UK government here, the US government supporting FIDO, Taiwanese government supporting FIDO. Really, we cut across industries, we cross borders. We're really seeing broad coalescence of everyone who's trying to move forward in providing better authentication to their users, moving towards FIDO, working with the FIDO ecosystem. So we didn't get into great depth on FIDO's technical specifications, but I wanted to make sure that you understand that FIDO is ready to deploy today. I mentioned briefly our specifications cover second factor primary and now passwordless authentication. You can match your use case to FIDO specification. Right? One thing that we see, obviously, is that use cases vary depending on who your users are. Are they sitting in an enterprise? Are they consumers? Are they primarily on desktops? Are they on mobile phones? Are they on shared desktops? Depending on your use case, FIDO specs support it. And most importantly, we have a very robust set of FIDO certified vendors that can help you be successful with your implementation. So HYPR is here today talking about their products and services. But by choosing a FIDO certified vendor, you can certainly prevent vendor lock-in. You can interoperate with other parts of the FIDO value chain. For example, a FIDO certified server will work with any FIDO certified authenticator. And it's really best practice to either specify FIDO certified in your RFPs and or to seek out these vendors to implement your vision for better authentication. Then last but not least, we want you to tap into the expanded set of resources that we're providing from the FIDO community. And so let's talk about that now. A little bit about our future. So whereas FIDO's focus has always been, if you look at kind of chapter 1 of FIDO and kind of development phase, right? So from say 2013 to say 2019-ish, building out the specifications, the foundational specifications that would enable people to successfully deploy FIDO. Those specifications, as we've just talked about, are now built into numerous endpoints. Over 2.5 billion devices can now support FIDO authentication. So our focus is very much now on, yes, smoothing out some issues with the specifications, but primarily on accelerating adoption. So one thing we're doing about this is establishing and documenting best practices. So inside the Alliance, we are doing several things. One, we have working groups creating white papers. We have what's called an enterprise deployment working group that's creating, for example, a very exciting set of white papers focused on why and how to use FIDO for passwordless employee logins. There's a whole series of papers targeted at different personas. Secondly, we're very happy to work with companies like HYPR to do case studies. We make these available for the public for you to see, how your use case and your situation may match up with other companies that have already successfully deployed FIDO, such as First Citrus Bank. Also, we bring this live, so we have webinars. Intuit is a company that's deployed FIDO to their customers. We had a great webinar with their product lead on this, their service lead on this, talking about not just why, but how they've deployed FIDO and the benefits they're seeing therein. So those are the types of things we're doing to drive awareness, drive education, hopefully help all of you better understand how you can implement FIDO for your customers today. Secondly, another key thing we're doing is based on feedback we got from service providers that they'd see benefit from starting to provide some common user experiences to consumers, especially at point of login. Right. So as George pointed out, passwords still persist, and people might not like passwords, might find them cumbersome, or most likely they'll use like 3, but they still use them. And so moving people forward to FIDO will take an education leap and a cognitive leap. I don't think it's so massive, because basically we're asking users to take the same action they use to unlock their phones to now log in, for example. But there is some change at point of login. So we're working to introduce a set of FIDO marks and assets that people can use at point of login to let consumers know that you're using FIDO. So on the left, you see that I mark, right? The I in FIDO. Any company deploying a FIDO certified server, so such as if you license one from HYPR or from someone else, or you roll your own, you can use the FIDO I mark or any of these assets we're showing you here, including this login with FIDO button or some iteration of that button. Additionally, we've seen some companies choose not to use a FIDO mark, but say something like powered by FIDO. And that little image at the bottom right of this slide shows a website we have, loginwithfido.com, which is meant to be supporting you in these rollouts, right? So if you use a powered by FIDO button, the question all your consumers would have is, well, what the heck is this? Because we've done no marketing to consumers so far. You can point people back to this website, and this loginwithfido.com website has consumer-focused messaging that explains exactly what FIDO is, why use it, and how it's being embraced by the marketplace. So those are things we're doing to help trigger consumers, make them aware of FIDO, all in the name of driving adoption, helping our stakeholders and all of you be more successful in moving beyond passwords. A little further afield are new work areas that FIDO is taking on. We've been very successful in implementing FIDO authentication. FIDO is widely seen accurately seen as unphishable, really bulletproof authentication that will protect any user, any use case. A quick anecdote on that: Google has rolled out FIDO security keys to all of its employees, 70,000 plus employees over a multi-year period. Not one of them has been successfully phished. And these are targets of your common phishing campaign, your Nigerian prince phishing campaign, but also targeted spear phishing campaigns. And not one has been successfully phished, which is great. That's a testament to the power of FIDO authentication. However, the toughest question we often get is like, well, what happens if I lose my FIDO authenticator? Possession-based authentication is great, but what if I lose it? The fact of the matter is, you should be deploying multiple authenticators, but many companies will revert to account re-enrollment. The problem with account enrollment, whether it's re-enrollment or account creation, is that it's, for too long, it's dependent on an outdated mechanism for identity verification, primarily knowledge-based authentication, right? So questions that they're pulling from credit bureaus or elsewhere that only you are meant to know. But the fact of the matter is, often you don't know the answers, and even worse, the hackers do, because this information's out in the public domain or the dark web. And so KBA is no longer adequate for identity verification. We need a better mechanism for possession-based account creation, which will allow for safer account recovery. The second adjacent space we're targeting is IoT. The security problems with IoT are well documented. You hear all sorts of horror stories about baby monitors being hacked and things like that. The core problem there is that the process for onboarding devices onto the network for too long has been relying on embedded passwords and things like that. So simply put, we're working to take the password out of IoT and out of the device onboarding process. So those are two new work areas we have going on. To show you this in another way, how our scope's expanding slightly, whereas we initially focused on the tip of that spear, just looking at authentication, we're now launching two new working groups. They're now launched and actually deep into their progress. One, an identity verification and binding. That's a working group. We also have a technical working group focused on IoT. If any of you are out there are interested in these areas and wish to get involved in these working groups, you certainly could join FIDO as a member to drive them forward. Another key initiative we're launching is a public conference called Authenticate. This is going to be our first public conference. The goal is to bring the community, the FIDO community, and really the broader authentication identity community together. We were all set to have a wildly successful event in June. Obviously, the best laid plans sometimes were foiled due to things like COVID-19. The good news for all of you is that you didn't miss it, and you can still catch it. It's a virtual conference now coming up November 9 to 20. It's free to attend. It'll be full of case studies, kind of deeper dives on technology. We have a great expo area. You can hear more from HYPR there, more from CVS, Aetna Health. I strongly encourage you to attend. It's free to attend. You can learn more at authenticatecon.com. So that's a little bit on FIDO. Just to kind of wrap up, FIDO is really the present and the future of authentication. We see FIDO authentication as industry's answer to the password problem or the password question. There's strong industry support, as we've documented, as you're seeing today. One thing that's really important to note is that the specifications reflects thousands, if not tens of thousands, of development hours from some of the brightest minds on the planet, all working together to build these specifications. We're continuing to innovate, and as I mentioned, last but not least, we're very focused on enablement. So working directly with our community, you can tap into FIDO's resources, work with HYPR, whomever you need, to be successful in moving your enterprise and your customers beyond being dependent on passwords. So George, let me pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. It was awesome. Looking forward to Authenticate. We need a conference. Yeah, Abbie, Barbir, would love to hear about your FIDO journey and how CVS Health and the Aetna teams scaled this to such a huge population of users. Do you want to kick us off?
Yep. Thank you, George. And thank you, Andrew. So so my name is Abbie, and I was hired first by Aetna, and the first job was to eliminate the reliance on passwords. And that was in the year 2015, 2016. And it was one of the best opportunities I've got because it's a challenging problem to solve. But I was lucky to be given that opportunity, to be honest with you, because for 3 different reasons. 1, very challenging problem to do. Number 2, I have a very good Tiger team that without them, I could not achieve anything. And they are the best team available. We're lucky to have them. And number 3, we had very nice, good partners that enabled this technology to come forward. And also I was lucky because when I joined, the FIDO technology was under development. So, like all these things came together for the dawn of the passwordless era. And this is very good thing to have happened. So our stages here is 3 stages. I'm going to talk at the beginning of the program when we were within Aetna, and then what happened during that adoption, and also the continuation of the next-gen authentication with the CVS acquisition because the requirements have changed. So next slide, please. Yeah, so when we joined, the problem that we're facing at Aetna, it was during the enrollment. Aetna was doing in the health business. So the enrollment process required at the completion of the enrollment process, 2 things needed to happen. You need to be identity vetted, and also you need to be credentialed. So you needed to have an account, you had to have a username, you had to have a password. So this was a binary. You could not stop in the middle and come back because the system was not designed for that. The system was designed, you come in, you enroll, we have a small short period to do it, and then you have to be credentialed. If you are not credentialed, you have to call the call center and this process repeats. A lot of the way we used to enroll you was based on knowledge-based authentication, which those days it was okay up to a point when we started having massive data breaches. So the value of KBA as identity vetting tool was diminishing. The threat due to KBA and public knowledge of the information was very high. So we needed to address the core source of the problem. How can we go and credential you in a way we eliminate the password, but we also solve the problem of the binary case? So we did separate the issue into 2 components. The vetting component is one side, and the credentialing and the account solving the password within the account is on a separate solution on its own. So the separation was needed because you could not solve the 2 problems together. It's very hard to solve. We needed to eliminate the reliance on password and eliminate the risk with them. The more you eliminate this problem, you reduce the reliance on using KBA to do account recovery. So you help in improving the security. So, we had to address this in a timely manner. At the time we were doing our development, FIDO was upcoming. It was not as mature as today. So remember, this is 2015, 2016. FIDO was initially going on mobile platforms. That was the first adoption. And also with the universal second factor authenticator. So we had two options with FIDO. The web solution was not ready yet. It was in the thinking, but it was not there yet. And the adoption at the browser level was not there. So even within this introductory, we needed to make decisions, okay? So you had to pick and choose which device is really usable with FIDO, which is not, who is adopting FIDO or not. Plus, you had to go and make a bet, should I go with FIDO or not? And I think we were lucky by making the right decisions here because FIDO matured and it was the de facto technology standard. Going next slide, please. Okay, to solve the issues that I said, we realized from the beginning, we are entering into new innovation with password replacement, and you could not do it in one step. It has to be a staged approach. So we needed to have a risk-based authentication engine with the understanding that we will start with some mobile, not all mobiles were ready, some mobile, and then we're going to have a combination of old legacy, new legacy, and also we needed to make sure we can accommodate the newer technologies as they come in. So as FIDO matures, we can go ahead and adapt with FIDO and offer better opportunities. So our approach was risk-based legacy adoption and work with the consumer, not against the consumer, meaning quote unquote. We did not want to sit down and educate the consumer on the value of biometric authentication. This was another battle that we did not want to do that. But Apple was doing that for us. The Touch ID and then the evolution to the Face ID. It was educating the consumer to use biometric as a replacement for PIN or replacement for passwords. So we wanted to ride the curve. There is no need to take extra burdens, but you can work with what the other vendors are doing and be part of a uniform solution to enable the achievement of replacing the password. Next. Okay, so based on this, we really had very good adoption. So the early releases of our mobile solution and had a great adoption. What we wanted is you start with the username password, and then if you get offered the chance to enroll through next-gen authentication, which is FIDO solution. And then if you're using an iPhone and you were happy to use the Touch ID, you used it. If you wanted to use the PIN, you used it. If you were on Android, you offered the same. We did not want to change the behavior. We just adopted your current interaction with your device as an extension for the FIDO authenticator, and we built on top of that. And then the experiment was really good. The adoption was very good. 99% adoption, and whoever went into next-gen authentication, they really did not go out of it. They stayed. So it was good. It also paid in terms of some of the higher risk applications. So we saw a huge and massive reduction in account takeover attempts, and also a lot of good savings in terms of the losses due to account takeover. So overall, it was really nice and good. It was a good experience for us and the consumers. And this is during the Aetna stage. And remember, the requirement there was very health specific, complete onboarding, complete identity vetting, and complete credentialing. And next slide, please. And then we were acquired by CVS, and this gave us really more and broaden opportunities here. CVS is a much bigger company than Aetna, and the use cases are much more wider and bigger. So all of a sudden, we start having requirements where you really don't want to be totally vetted. You don't want to create a logon account. You want to come in as a guest account, and then we need to protect that guest account, because if you have a password with a guest account, you need to reset that password. So we needed to adapt. So the requirement changed, but we were lucky because the core foundation was still solid. It still can accommodate the changing requirements. Risk-based passwordless authentication works very wonderfully, and we are now adopting and changing to meet a more diverse requirement from our users, whether they are internal application adopters or from our customers and consumers. So we had the opportunity to transform because we did do our bet on interoperability and non-standards, and it really worked very well. Next. Yeah, so, and the journey doesn't stop. So the next-gen authentication now is fitting within a bigger opportunity, which is CIM. We need to start simplifying the interaction because the way FIDO originally was deployed, at least within Aetna, it was per app. So the FIDO credential is, per user, per device, per app. And once you start having multiple applications within a company, the management of multiple FIDO credentials become a little bit harder because you have to manage multiple relationships. And this is not because of any fault of the FIDO, because FIDO was designed to do a relying party with the client. But the consumer journey is a little bit more maturing now. The trend in the industry is to start managing a relationship with the consumer. And we need to adapt and start innovate to make sure we meet into that criteria, have one common visibility of the consumer across all of their interactions, have one common trust anchors with the consumer to restore their identity and do account recovery and prevent account takeover. FIDO requires stronger identity vetting because FIDO is giving you a very strong credential. And you cannot issue a strong credential to the wrong entity. So the innovation now is how we can integrate and improve and innovate on the identity vetting to make sure it catch up with the opportunities that FIDO have given us to solve the risks associated with authentication. Next. Yeah, and that was on the consumer side. On the workforce, it's also extension of the same story. Workforce a little bit easier because you have more control in terms of the choice of devices and fine-grained policy enforcement and how things will be deployed. Consumer is a little bit harder because you have to support a multitude of devices, access mechanisms, and different consumer behavior. But the lessons that we learned from the consumer experience, we are moving it to the workforce experience, and they are going very well. And we are now testing and prototyping to make sure we can go into the FIDO journey for the workforce. Okay, what's the key for success? Actually, a lot of things, right team, right vendors, collaboration, and also reliance on industry and industry standard. We had a lot of discussions with so many, solutions that are non-FIDO based or FIDO lookalike, and we decided to not to go that route. And the focus on standard base and interoperability really paid off at the end because now we are part of an ecosystem where every time a new browser or a new core vendor support the FIDO solution, we piggyback on that. So that was one of the good decisions that we had to make. Plus, we really had very good, and we still have very good internal support and commitment from our execs to protect our consumers and do the right thing and go the extra mile to make sure security is our top priority. And we are blessed with that. We really did not have to sit down and sell very hard to show the value of a stronger authentication. We had open arms and we had all the support we needed. And we are lucky to be, within this progressive mentality where protection and security is job number one. So I think I'll stop for here.
Thank you, Abbie. That was awesome. I appreciate you sharing with the team how you all actually got this to be successful. For everyone on the call, look, maybe we should, wrap things up for the audience and give them time for Q&A. I know we've heard some great stuff from CVS Health and Abbie, Barbir. We've heard from the FIDO Alliance leaders directly, and would love to open the floor for some questions. But to conclude what we talked about today, I think the general advice for everyone on this call is not all FIDO deployments are the same, right? Open standards are a way of doing things. They're a means to an end, and they're a great means to that end. But how you arrive at that end is up to you. So, there are things you should look for in a FIDO-based solution. You should try to, explore how these different products differentiate, how passwordless authentication solutions differentiate between, your workforce, between your consumer use cases. And obviously, as Holger mentioned, we'll be giving you some resources after this call so you can learn more about how FIDO is different and how it's being deployed across millions of users. So, with that said, Holger, I'd love to open the floor up to some questions, for us and the team. So handing it off back to you and the audience. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Now, how do you convince management to fund a passwordless initiative?
Oh, that's a good one. Fighting for budget is always the real challenge in cybersecurity, right? So look, I think one of the beautiful things about passwordless that we've heard about from customers and companies who have deployed it is it's one of those situations where the security teams and the line of business really agree on something, right? Where they're not getting in each other's way. And going passwordless has unlocked revenue opportunities. It's made user experience better, and it's such a big impact on the user that in some cases, security teams have actually gotten lines of business to pay for it. Abbie, I don't remember if it was you guys, but I think the budget for authentication actually came from digital transformation budget. Is that correct?
We started from a global security at the Aetna days, and now it's from the digital transformation.
That's really cool because it's one of those rare times when InfoSec can actually tap into the digital transformation budgets that are often really massive. So my advice would be to try to tap into that line of business budget by convincing them it's going to make them a much better outcome for their users.
I can also add, I mean, the COVID era, it's like a driver. You cannot not afford to have a strong authentication today, where remote work is the way to go. So, if this is one of the optimum motivation, and also if you're supporting a lot of users or consumers, and you're going to spend a lot of your time doing password resets with all the risk associated with that, there is an issue. So the time to us to upgrade security is now.
That's a good point. Thank you, Abbie. How is FIDO different from just using Face ID or Touch ID or some other device biometrics? And isn't the user experience the same, Andrew?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is in fact the same. We were talking earlier about MFA opt-in rates and the need, for simpler, strong authentication, and how if it's too complex, people won't keep on opting in. And so FIDO's always strove to have a simpler user experience, using the device and same mechanisms people know today on devices such as Touch ID, Face ID, Windows Hello, things like that. The difference is twofold. One, that action has primarily or historically been an unlock action, unlocking my phone with my face or my fingerprint. And now that same action I used to unlock is something you can use to log in. Secondly, and perhaps more important, is what's happening behind the scenes. So using FIDO versus just a kind of a password cut and paste means that the service provider themselves are better protecting their assets and their customers. At the end of the day, storing passwords, whether it's 10,000, 100,000, 10 million, or 10 billion passwords on your servers, is a liability to your organization. The only way to get rid of that liability is to move beyond passwords and replace those, replace that dependence with things like, public-private key pairs, where you're having public keys which have no material value for hackers to steal or reuse, versus having passwords. So yes, it's the same user experience, but the benefit of moving to FIDO is that you can go down this path of eventually getting rid of that liability of passwords and shared secrets on your server, while still providing consumers the same kind of comfortable user experience they know with on-device biometrics.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, one thing I can add there, Andrew, is over the past couple of years, we've seen companies openly say that Touch ID, Face ID, it wasn't clear to them, but they're still just using a password. And I think what FIDO does that's extremely groundbreaking is without really altering the user experience, it gets rid of the password. That's a really easy way for people to try to compartmentalize it.
Very good. Thank you, George. How do you use passwordless for call center scenarios? And the second part of that question is, what other use cases do you see benefiting from passwordless?
So call center is an interesting one. Actually, if you go to our website, there's a great case study on Ireland's largest health insurer who deployed passwordless for call center authentication. And they're using it for users who call into customer support and they get a push notification to their phone. It's essentially a passwordless FIDO-based authentication, which they use to approve who they are and authorize that they're the one calling in. And that's a really exciting use case for call center approval and call center authentication, because it not only gets people to more quickly identify themselves and prove that that's who's on the phone, but it also incentivizes mobile app adoption. And that's something really difficult for a lot of companies, is getting people to adopt their mobile apps and building incentives around that. And one of the ways of doing that is making a better customer service experience. So that's really cool for call center authentication. For the second question, can you repeat it? Was it about use cases or new use cases?
Yeah, it's new use cases. So what other new use cases do you see benefiting from passwordless?
Oh, IoT is a big one, man. So what I was super excited when Andrew was talking about the IoT, because when you think about passwordless authentication and you think about keyless authentication, they're kind of the same thing, right? Like, how do I unlock my door or unlock my car? I use a key. Is the password a key? Kind of, yeah. One is physical and one is digital. And as the IoT comes online, we really have to rethink how we authenticate to these things. You're not going to use a password to log into your car, right? So I think the next big, massive use case or collection of use cases is authenticating to the IoT. And I think keyless authentication is very much going to be powered by FIDO, as Andrew suggested.
That's exciting. Thank you, George. The next question, I think, Abbie, is for you. And the question is, what are some of the options for passwordless authentication, right, that you're aware of, that you've looked at, and how do they compare? Abbie?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There are various solutions that hide the password, and they are being marketed as passwordless. Some of those solutions just rely on QR codes, or basically using the Face ID, Touch ID to get access to release a token. Underlying foundation of those is still a password in one form or the other. So FIDO-based solutions are the best way to go. There are some other scenarios where you could allow for passwordless hiding a password, but in general, the integration of FIDO, it go back into the term of a true passwordless. And this is why we, at least for the purpose of this webinar, the term true passwordless need to be really explained, because the underlying technology after that is basically hiding the password. And this is not good enough on its own, because what it does, it gives false sense of security while the underlying vulnerabilities of using a password remain. And we should be very careful about that.
Indeed. Thank you, Abbie. It looks like we have time for one more question. And George, the question's for you. How big of a team would it require to deploy passwordless, and how long does the average deployment take?
Oh, wow. Let me deflect once to Bojan Simic, our co-founder and CTO. Bojan works really closely with the teams who have actually deployed HYPR. Bojan, could you field that about for team size and how long it takes?
Absolutely. So it really depends on the use case, but the two primary use cases, if you're deploying HYPR for your workforce or for your consumers. With regards to the workforce, it can take anywhere from hours to a few days to get the initial group of users up and running. Typically we can start with one or two primary use cases within a couple of hours and get a preliminary group of individuals up and running and using the product, and then evangelizing it throughout the organization. On the consumer side, it takes a little bit longer because you have more stakeholders involved. You have your user experience folks involved, you have your mobile developers involved, your web developers, but we can typically do an initial integration within a few days, and then start providing the technology as part of the actual release process itself. So if you choose the right partner with regards to implementing and deploying true passwordless security, it shouldn't take you more than a few days to integrate and start getting some users on the system. But again, what George mentioned earlier about not all FIDO is the same, that's where the trick is you really have to partner with somebody who puts a lot of thought into around making the experience of integrating passwordless authentication for your developers and for your technology team as easy as possible, so that you don't need to have a separate team that just works on that. You can just make it as part of your normal workflows.
Excellent. Thank you, Bojan. All right. And with that, we're at the finish line for today's session. Thank you, panel, for sharing your insights on passwordless security and workforce authentication. As we're closing this webinar, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Now, this concludes today's session. I hope we will see all of you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.